name is Reverend Mike Young. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, and for the next few weeks we'll still be the interim minister here at the Unitarian Universalist Church, Studio City. I went to and graduated from Andover Newton Theological School because at the time, back in the mid-60s, it had the best biblical scholarship department of any school in the country at the time. And that's one of the things I was looking for because that whole issue has fascinated me since I was a Sunday school kid and kept asking the embarrassing questions of the Sunday school teachers to the point where my father told me, why don't you just keep your mouth shut in Sunday school if you insist on going? Because they kept getting mad at me for asking questions. And it's an area that has continued to be of interest to me, partly because as I have gone on into ministry, I'm realizing just how biblically illiterate the overwhelming majority of Christendom, to say nothing of the population in general, actually is. And one of the things that happens is that in all of the major Protestant theological schools that train Lutherans and Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Baptists, all of those standard brand denominations, we all studied the same books. We all learned the same material that I'm going to in a minute talk about. And we all came out into our parishes after graduating, and most of us kept our mouths shut and preached a version of Christianity that is at about the level of third grade Sunday school, which is part of the reason for the degree of biblical illiteracy that characterizes Western Christianity. Because most people only know the literature, the Christian literature, from having heard a few verses as a part of a worship service on Sunday morning with no context, no historical setting, no sense of what was going on historically in the situation that those few verses might have something to do with. And the result is that what little biblical knowledge people typically have just sort of hovers in a mist with no connection to history, to language, to any of the things that were actually going on at the time. And from the very beginning, even when I was asking my Sunday school teachers questions, it seemed to me that in order to understand a particular piece of sacred literature, you needed to know who wrote it, who did they write it for, what was the purpose of writing it, what kind of language were they using, were they writing it as a historian would write, were they writing it as a lawyer would write, were they writing it as a poet would write, what was the nature of the literature, and what was going on historically in the situation. Well, there's an incredible amount of information like that available, and over the years there's just been more and more as biblical scholars have acquired more information about what was happening at those times, acquired more pieces of literature from that time, and I'm going to show you some of just how dramatic that difference is, and know therefore much more about the language in which the New Testament literature is written. And if you know the language, then you can translate better. And historically, the way we have translated Old and New Testament and ancient literature in general is to evolve a word list of the words that are in the book that you want to translate. You find a one-for-one match to those words, and then you string the words in the language you want to translate it into together. If you've ever looked at a piece of poetry, you know that probably translating that way is going to miss an awful lot of nuance, an awful lot of meaning. The metaphors won't come through. Most people reading, for example, the book of Amos have no idea that the book of Amos is full of puns. But they only work in Hebrew. And there's no way you can translate those puns into English without an awful lot of footnotes and a sense of how the words relate in Hebrew. So that as a result of both better understanding of the language of that time, more samples of the literature and the kinds of similar kinds to the ones that are in our New Testament, more knowledge of the historical context, it is possible today to know a whole lot more about what one reads when you flip the Gospel of Matthew open and start reading. And since lay people were not getting access to that, 26 years ago, a group of scholars, New Testament scholars, who were members of the National Association of New Testament Scholars, the guys and gals who worked in the major theological schools and universities all around the country, decided that they were really irritated at the fact that they were doing all this neat stuff and nobody knew about it. It was not getting to pastors, much less to lay folk. And so they started what has come to be called the Jesus Seminars. The organization is actually the West Star Institute, but it's both a group of scholars representing about the full dimension of from conservative to liberal on issues of biblical scholarship. And they debated the issues heatedly. They have produced a publishing house, and they published the books, so that the literature is now available, at least, to lay folk and to people like me who want to keep up. And I've been a member of the Jesus Seminars, a fellow, now for, I guess, about 18 years. And as a way of keeping up with what's going on. So who wrote? Why did they write? Where did our New Testament come from? At the time that Jesus was crucified, Palestine and the area around Jerusalem was in radical chaos and had been for more than 50 years. There were riots, there were occasions when guerrilla groups were attempting to kill Roman soldiers. There were tax revolts. Pontius Pilate, who comes off in the New Testament pretty good, he washes his hands of the problem and says, let the Sanhedrin do what they want to with Jesus, was actually nowhere near that nice a guy. Among other things, at the time that Jesus would have been just beginning his ministry, or perhaps slightly before. It's hard to tell when he actually began. Pontius Pilate decided he wanted to build a water pipe to one of the places in Jerusalem where there was a major installation of Roman soldiers. And so he took the money from the treasury of the temple and used that to build his aqueduct. The people rose up in righteous indignation, and several thousand people gathered in front of Pontius Pilate's official residence and were raising hell with him. And he sent his soldiers into the crowd in mufti, with clothing that the average citizen would be wearing instead of in their uniforms, but with their swords tucked underneath their robe. And on his signal, his soldiers removed the swords and committed slashing about them and killed thousands of people. That's what was going on in Jesus' day, at the time that all of the events that are reported in our New Testament were beginning to happen. It was not a quiet, peaceful thing. In fact, the place that Jesus is from, up in Galilee, was one of the hotbed areas of the rebellion against the Roman soldiers and against the taxes. Judas Iscariot had been a member of one of those guerrilla groups. The Iscariot part is not part of its name. His name actually is Judas, one of the Sicarii. The Sicarii was one of those guerrilla groups that specialized in sneaking into Roman encampments at night and slitting as many throats as they could before anybody got awakened enough to chase them off. This is what was happening in Jesus' day. And so it's not surprising that, first of all, the Romans were unhappy with him and would have conspired with the Jews if necessary, or all by themselves, quite more likely, to have him crucified. Crucifixion was what they did not to ordinary crooks, but to political prisoners. These were rebels, and they were crucified right on the major public road where everybody could see, frankly, as a way of terrorizing the rest of the population not to resist the Romans. A regular thief or even murderer would simply have been killed by the Romans. They didn't mess around. But they really did it up dramatically when it was somebody that was a potential rebel. So the Romans would have been unhappy with Jesus. The Jews also, the temple-related Jews, were unhappy with Jesus. He was from what had been northern Israel, the section that at the time that Solomon's sons inherited the kingdom and began fighting with each other and eventually split the kingdom into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom following one form of Judaism, of Jewish religion of that era, the southern kingdom following a very different form built very much around the temple itself. So that it's the Judea and the environs of Jerusalem that is the Judaism that we know in the New Testament. Jesus represents a tradition that is much more tied to the prophets and hold positions that say, it doesn't matter that you obey all of the rules. Even if you manage to obey all of them, that's not what religion is about. Religion is about what's going on inside. This is the clue when Jesus says things like, "You've heard it said of old, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you have committed adultery with her already." Because it's what's going on your insides that matters, not whether you actually obey some set of rules, including the Ten Commandments. Just obeying the law doesn't do it. Just going and doing the necessary sacrifices at the temple is not what religion is about, as Jesus is teaching it and as he is confronting the Sanhedrin and the Jewish temple authorities. Meanwhile, the Jewish temple authorities have this cozy relationship with the Romans such that they're allowed to continue Judaism in the temple under very close Roman scrutiny. In fact, the Romans kept hold of the clerical garb of the high priest and the regular priests of the temple, and only doled the garb out for special occasions, and then took it back again, because they were maintaining control of what was going on in the temple. Because this was a potential source of rebellion. And the Jewish authorities were right to be worried about the rebelliousness of the Jewish people, because in fact, only about 40 years after Jesus was crucified, it did come apart. Virtually the whole city of Jerusalem rose up in rebellion against the Roman soldiers, and in 70 AD, the Romans finally sacked Jerusalem and totally destroyed the temple, and it's been destroyed ever since. And even then, that was in 70 AD, in 150 AD, they had to come back and do it again, because another Messiah had arisen and gathered a bunch of people around him, and still were rebelling against the Romans. The Jewish authorities kept this very careful balance with the Romans so that they could maintain Jewish religion without getting squashed by the Romans. Jesus was a major threat to that nice, neat arrangement that they had, and this is clearly part of the reason why the Roman authorities, the Jewish authorities were trying to trick him up. And you see in several of the teachings of Jesus, their attempts to ask him questions that would get him in trouble. The classic one, we talked about it I think a little bit last week, the classic one is somebody asked him, one of the representatives of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish authorities asked him, should we pay taxes to the Romans? Well, if he said, yes, you should pay taxes to the Romans, the people, the populace that he was preaching to would have been really unhappy with him because they hated the Romans and the taxes. But if he said, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to the Romans would have come in and arrested him and crucified him, which eventually they did anyway. But what he did was to say, anybody got a coin? Somebody handed him a coin, and he held it up. He said, whose likeness is on here? And somebody said, Caesar. And Jesus said, yes. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Sub-message. What things, in fact, are Caesar's? Nothing is Caesar's. Everything Caesar has, in Palestine at least, is stolen, is taken, is commandeered. Doesn't belong to Caesar. But by using the twist, he manages to get in trouble with neither. And my imagination is, at least, is that the bulk of the population knew exactly what he was saying. But since he didn't say it openly, they didn't come in and snatch him. But this is the conflict that's going on in the middle of his ministry as he's trying to teach a very different understanding of Jewish religion from the sort of rules-bound religion and sacrifice and temple-bound religion that the Jewish authorities are holding. They finally do take him. And it is interesting to peruse the literature trying to tease out the degree to which he knew what was going to be happening. It looks like he instructs Judas to betray him. And Judas's suicide may represent the fact that Judas really did betray him at Jesus' command and really thought that Jesus had something up his sleeve and was going to pull this off. And when Jesus didn't pull it off, when he did get crucified, did get killed, Judas is distraught. But it's fairly clear from the literature, reading carefully, that Jesus knew exactly what was going on. In that upper room, he turns to Judas and he says, go, and what you do quickly. Judas goes and gets the authorities and brings the authorities to where he knows Jesus is going to be praying, and he is arrested. This gets skipped over, usually, at Easter time. In fact, there was a wonderful book written in the late 19th century that says that we really ought to be worshiping Judas, because if Jesus really was God, or really was divine, the Son of God, and really was resurrected and taken to heaven, the one who really sacrificed everything was not Jesus, but Judas. I never have been sure whether the book was written fully tongue-in-cheek or not. It's written as if this was for real. But one of the things I have back in Honolulu in my library back there in the storage bin is a fascinating copy of that book from the late 19th century. After Jesus dies, the whole Jesus movement falls apart. Groups of people go home. Some of them who are in Jerusalem stay in Jerusalem, but they're clearly dispirited at best. And unlike the impression you get from an Easter Sunday celebration, it is not on Easter Sunday that the rest of the followers of Jesus find out that he has whatever resurrection means, that he is risen. It's days, perhaps weeks later, if you read the literature carefully. We have, for liturgical reasons, had it happen Friday, Saturday, Sunday, boom, resurrection. But it's clear that the Jesus movement community did not know it for quite a long while afterwards, until the information began emerging. People began saying, I have seen, I have experienced. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit at the end here. Because what happened was an emergence of an incredibly fascinating set of communities. And the communities that emerged in response to whatever this did that happened after Jesus was killed, those emerging communities were in the ancient world absolutely unique, unprecedented. Even the Roman authorities acknowledged that these Christian communities were peculiar, fascinating communities. There was neither Jew nor Greek in them. Didn't matter what origin you were. There was neither male nor female. Women had the same roles in them as men had. There was not slave or free. Slaves had full citizenship within the church community, equal with free people. This egalitarian community, which in many ways reflected what was happening between Jesus and his followers while during his ministry, where Jesus had what is called open table, rather than follow the purity laws and don't eat with unbelievers laws of the Jewish establishment. Jesus had women, hookers, tax collectors, ordinary folk, and apparently some upper class folk as well. Because this fellow who loaned the Jesus followers his place to place Jesus after he died was a rich man. So there's this interesting egalitarian community that surrounded him is one of the characteristics of those Jesus communities that emerged after Jesus' death. And they were looking for, expecting that something was going to happen. Jesus had said, there are some amongst you here today that will still be alive when they see the Son of Man coming with power. The Son of Man coming with power is Jesus' code phrase for the kingdom of heaven finally arriving with full power on the earth. Not sometime in the future, not after you die, but in real history time. They were literally expecting that at some time, like maybe next Thursday, this was going to happen. Well, it didn't happen. The first crisis they ran into was whether or not you had to be a Jew in order to be a Christian. The community in Jerusalem, headed by Jesus' brother James, insisted that if you were not Jewish, you had to become Jewish in order to become a Christian. For them, Christianity, this Jesus movement, was a movement within Judaism, a perfecting of Jewish religion, a reform within Judaism. And you had, if you were a male, you had to make the penultimate sacrifice of the quarter inch of skin and be circumcised. This was a major commitment. For some of Jesus' followers, including St. Paul, what emerged was seen as a new religious movement entirely. Not a reform within Judaism, but something that was grafted on, is the image that Paul uses. And it is not necessary to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. This was a major conflict, and you'd see it played out a little bit from a very prejudiced point of view in the book of Acts in the New Testament. But this was the very first crisis, and there was a big battle between the Jesus followers in Jerusalem and probably in much of Palestine, and the Jesus followers that began emerging as word of this got out and missionaries went out, followers of Jesus went out telling the story and creating these fascinating Jesus movement communities all around the Mediterranean, down into Alexandria as well as around past Rome. By the time, at the end of the first century, there were Jesus communities stretching all the way, maybe even into China, but to the east, all the way around into present-day Spain, and all around Asia Minor and North Africa. And all of them expecting that this something was going to happen next Thursday. When that didn't happen, when the last of the people who had been there when Jesus was teaching began dying off, people began realizing, we got to get this written down. It's only then that a literature begins to emerge within first century Christianity. There'd be no point in writing down books when it's all going to change next Thursday. But as that didn't happen, the first of the pieces of literature that began to be written down were variations on the Sermon on the Mount. These were people writing down what they remembered Jesus having taught. And these documents were used in the small communities, Jesus communities, to teach new converts. And the book of Mark is in some ways like that. The book of Mark is the first actual narrative that we know of, where the story from Jesus' emergence in his ministry with his baptism to his crucifixion. The book of Mark tells that story. It opens with Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. It ends with the women coming to the sepulcher, finding the door rolled away and the place empty. And it says, they went away and told no one. Period. That's where the book of Mark ends. At the time of the writing of the book of Mark, this idea of an empty tomb resurrection is a peculiar idea. It is not what everybody knew about, obviously. We know this is the case because we know that Mark was written sometime shortly after 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, because he knows about it. A couple of things he drops in the book. He knew that the temple had been destroyed, so it had to have been written after, and probably just shortly after, so 40 years at least after Jesus' death. But even earlier than that, we have, and the earliest literature that we have about the Jesus movement is the letters of St. Paul that were written between 50 and 65 AD. This is the oldest layer of literature that we have. And we know, for example, that St. Paul did not know about an empty tomb, had never heard the story of an empty tomb, and could not have believed the story of the empty tomb if he had heard it. He lists off the resurrection appearances, whatever that means. And then, and in the process, in his letter to the Corinthians, he's defending his legitimacy as a real apostle, as just as good as all the rest of those apostles. And he lists these appearances, some of which we knew about, some of which we don't. But he lists the appearance to him, as he says, as one born out of joint with the times. Last of all to me, he also appeared to me. Now, Paul would not have listed his appearance in that same list if everybody knew that we were talking about an empty tomb. Because everybody would have said, well, sure, you had a psychotic episode. But everybody else experienced the real bodily risen Jesus. That he would list his as the same kind of experience says that the early church meant something other than a revivified cadaver as resurrection. So then we have not until at least 80, maybe as late as 100 AD, does Matthew and Luke get written. Matthew, supposedly the tax collector. Luke, the sidekick of Paul. Mark was not an eyewitness to the teachings, the ministry of Jesus. We know who Mark was. Mark was Peter's traveling companion, and at most would have been about 8 years old when Jesus was crucified. He was not exactly your best witness to these events. He was telling the story in the book of Mark as it had been told to him. And the tradition is that it was Peter that told the tradition to Mark, and that's what Mark later wrote down after Peter had been crucified, killed in Rome. But Matthew and Luke both use 11/12 of the book of Mark verbatim. They copy. They had Mark at one side in there. They obviously had some other material besides what was in Luke. They had a book, or at least a manuscript, of the teachings of Jesus, and both Matthew and Luke use this manuscript. It is referred to by scholars as the Q document. Again, they used it virtually verbatim, each of them did, but they used it differently. Matthew uses it in 3 clumps. One of those clumps is the Sermon on the Mount. But there are these 3 major sermons that Jesus teaches in Matthew. But in Luke, it's in small pieces, scattered all through the 3 years of his ministry. Neither of these are eyewitness accounts clearly. There's no early book that says this is the gospel according to Matthew. There was an early book. We know there was. We got copies of it, but it didn't have a title page. It was simply a scroll that starts out. Only by later traditional attribution is it labeled Matthew, or in the case of Luke, or even in the case of Mark. This literature about the immediate stuff about Jesus gets written at the end of the century as people are beginning to realize this we need to get this stuff written down. The Gospel of John, similarly, although the style of the Gospel of John is very different, it's still, the date is in that last decade or and a half or so of the first century. The church fathers had from that period, when the literature was written, until 325, when orthodoxy was determined at the Council of Nicaea. Constantine called the bishops together and said, I want you to be the religion of the Roman Empire. You need to agree on which are the right books. You need to agree on what the correct doctrines are, and you need to enforce those evenly and uniformly throughout the empire. The church fathers had 225 years to have removed the contradictions and disagreements between the four Gospels. They didn't. That they didn't says to us that they understood that literature differently than we try to press a historical document model onto it today. They knew that that these pieces of literature were written to get people to understand the emotional depth of what happened to people in those first Jewish communities, first Christian communities. That's the kind of literature that it is. And it's the kind of literature that the other Gospels that are out there also were. This is a collection of them. It's Greek on one side and English on the other. But there are 50 of the things. The Gospel according to this, the Gospel according to that. There's just this incredible literature from the first, they're called the Apocryphal Gospels, which simply means they never made it into the official canon. And these are not all of the ones that exist. There are a few more. This one has 25 of those Gospels, including the four we're familiar with. There was a lot of literature out there, and what we have not been taught is that the differing understandings of who Jesus was, what his ministry was about, what the meaning of his death was, and what resurrection is or isn't. There were more opinions on those subjects out there in that first century of the Jesus movement than there are about the denominations of Christianity today. The diversity of opinion was absolutely fascinating in retrospect. A lot of those documents, the church in the 4th century sought out and destroyed. And the only reason we have some of them is because they were systematically hidden out by their followers. The classic example is the Nag Hammadi find, where a young Egyptian boy stumbles into a hole in the ground and finds these jars with papyrus in them. He hauls them home and says, "Look, Mom." Mom says, "Oh yeah, that'll work." And his mom uses them as kindling to start the fire in the stove, until somebody notices, "Those are bloody old." This is in the 1950s. And as those documents finally got to somebody and got translated, one of the things that was in them, for example, is the only complete copy we have of the Gospel of Thomas. We knew that it existed because the church fathers made reference to it. There were some bits and pieces of it that had been found various places, but this was the only relatively complete copy of it that we had. And over the last 50 years, from those kinds of finds, from finds of documents in monasteries, from copies of things that were written into the back page of old books. But what was copied from has been lost. But the copy that some monk wrote into the back page of another document was found in a library someplace. So there's incredible trove of material that suggests that the understanding of Jesus by his followers ranged all the way from folk like the Ebionites, who were chased out of Jerusalem by the Romans when they destroyed the temple. And they went out, the Ebionites went out into the desert in what's now Saudi Arabia, and lived out there as nomads. And they understood Jesus to be a prophet in the tradition of the prophets, a critique and a critic of that temple Judaism that Jesus was unhappy with. One of the interesting pieces of this is that the Jews that Muhammad learned Jewish history from were the Ebionites, which is why in the Quran Jesus is a prophet, not a deity. That's perhaps one extreme of the Jesus movement conceptions. At the other extreme is a movement that said that Jesus really was God, come down on earth, putting on an appearance of being human and walking around amongst us. He really was God, faking being a human being. And in the gospel of that particular heretical group, when Jesus is taken to be crucified, it's a member of the audience pulled out of the audience as the Roman soldiers are taking him, Simon the Cyrene. Simon is pulled out to carry Jesus' cross because Jesus keeps falling down. And when they get out to Golgotha, the Romans were told to crucify 3 people. The Romans crucified 3 people. They didn't give a damn which 3 people. And it was Simon who was crucified, not Jesus. And this was absolutely necessary because since Jesus was actually God faking it, Jesus could have hung there on the cross indefinitely or something. And so for the crucifixion and the resurrection and all that to happen, Jesus had to, in effect, God had to, in effect, fake his own death. God can't die. So you have these 2 really wild extremes of vision of what Jesus means. And almost every possibility in between, using some of the religious ideas from Egyptian religion, using some of the religious ideas from the religion of the Roman soldiers, using some of the religious ideas from Zoroastrianism, much of it steeped in the spiritualism of Neoplatonic philosophic thought, whether it's a spiritual realm and a physical realm, and the 2 operate by different rules, which is completely different from Jewish thought. There's no dimension of the spirit where the rules don't apply in Jewish thought at all, but there is in Greek and Neoplatonic thought. So you have this mishmash of ideas. One of them that's tossed in there is from a philosopher, Jewish philosopher in Alexandria, whose understanding is that the logos, which is the Greek word for word, the logos is the principle of rationalization and organization that is at the heart of the creation of the universe. It is by the Logos that God creates the universe out of chaos. And this concept of the Logos is right there in the very beginning of the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and by the Word did God create the universe." And if you go back and read it correctly, it's "in the beginning was the Logos." This is a technical, theological, philosophical term. It's that misunderstanding that has gotten the New Testament to be referred to as the Word of God, which then gets further misunderstood as the words of God, as if somehow the New Testament had been whispered in the ears of scribes by the Holy Spirit, and that's how we got it. It isn't how we got it. We got the literature from the response of the people to their own religious experience. And then 200 years later, the bishops, for purposes of political power, deciding which versions of all of that are the ones that are going to be empowered. And that has been orthodoxy since 325, Council of Nicaea. But the options, the choices, the differing, sometimes just a matter of completely differing metaphors. And sometimes when you try to describe especially deeply emotional events using metaphorical language, it's not difficult to come up with one set of metaphors for an experience and another set of metaphors for an experience. Same experience, but the metaphors won't fit. They're just different pictures. That's in some of the Gospels. The rest of the New Testament is largely the letters of St. Paul, except that about half of the ones that are attributed to St. Paul clearly were not written by St. Paul. When you sit down and try to read the Greek, you realize this is not the same vocabulary, this is not the same syntax, this is not the same terms of phrase in these books that St. Paul used in the ones we know for sure were written by St. Paul. So about half of them are fake. And to call them fake is not to be fair, because one of the things that was characteristic of that day is that if you had a set of ideas that you really were sure were so, it was not considered inappropriate to attribute them to somebody else. I mean, after all, poor little me, I'm not anybody, but this is what Paul would have said on this subject if anybody had bothered to ask him. And so I write it and I say it's Paul. This is a normal part of the literature scene of the first couple of centuries of Christianity. Not just within Christianity, but in the larger culture as well. This is not an unusual event. So the literature that we have is the literature that comes out of the first century approximately of the Christian movement, as people are responding to it, as they are trying to find the ways to communicate it to other people who weren't there and who didn't experience that initial explosion of the community. There are a number of documents out there that it's not clear why didn't make it into the New Testament. One of them is called the Didache, which is simply Greek for the teaching. And this one was a very straightforward catechism. This was a document that was used to teach new converts about Christianity. It was the very first catechism that anybody ever wrote, as near as we know. And it didn't get attributed to somebody with a famous first century name. Maybe that's the reason why it didn't make it into the canon, I don't know, but it didn't. And it's quite interesting because when you read the Didache, you find that what was being taught by that particular religious community was different from what the Nicene Creed folk handed us down as orthodoxy. Only slightly different, but it's different. Oh, I mentioned the differences between the Gospels. And there are lots of them in there. I love it when somebody comes up to me and says, well, but why don't you believe in the Bible? Because it's absolutely, every word of it is absolutely true. There are no contradictions in the Bible at all. And I say, oh, really? When Jesus appeared to these various people and then rose into heaven, where did he rise from? And depending upon which gospel is their favorite or which they remember having read, they will say, oh, well, it was up by the Sea of Galilee, or it was outside the edge of Jerusalem, or it was on the mountain. Because there are 4 different places that Jesus supposedly ascended from. 4 different parts of Palestine, being watched by 4 different but slightly overlapping groups of people. No agreement as to who was there. No agreement amongst the 4 Gospels as to who found the empty tomb. No agreement amongst the 4 Gospels as to who Jesus appeared to, including the list that St. Paul has that I mentioned. There are a couple of references there that are not in the New Testament. And the differences are not there because the literature is faked or false. The literature is there because it's real. It grew out of the experience of first century Christian communities. So did the other Gospels. And some of them are as wild and woolly in their imagery as the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament. Some of them are much more straightforward, and some of them are kind of embarrassing. The Gospel according to Mary, for example, has Mary Magdalene, giving Jesus' major disciples a hard time because she got what Jesus was teaching and they didn't, and she's chewing them out for not getting it. And what she's saying is rather interesting, because it's a very different point of view about the teaching of Jesus from what you would get in 3rd grade Sunday school. The Gospel of Thomas ends with Jesus telling his disciples that when Mary becomes a man, she will be one of the disciples too. What does that mean? We don't know. There's a whole vocabulary in there of hints in all these, that there are layers of meaning and metaphors and turns of phrase that we don't understand. Which is why, for me, there's the continuing fascination. It was 325 that the bishops decided what books were in and what books were out of the New Testament. And they went around destroying, or trying to destroy, those that they decided were not sacred literature. That's the reason why those documents were buried in the hole for the little boy, young man to find in Egypt, because they had been buried there to hide them from the representatives of the bishops who were coming through, burning books, burning scrolls. But the legend is told, and it is only a legend, a story. But the story is that the bishops all gathered in the library in Nicaea, and they put copies of the various books of the New Testament on this big table. And they put a lot of literature on there. And then the windows and doors were locked, and they all left and locked the place up. And they came back the next morning, and all of the pieces of literature that were still on the table were declared the New Testament, and those that had fallen off the table onto the floor were excluded. The point of the legend is that the actual selection of which books ended up in the official Bible was almost that random, that somebody snuck in and knocked the ones off. It was not a systematic theological decision. It was a lot of politics. The books that came, the pieces of literature that got put together into the New Testament are those that came from the more powerful areas of Christendom. It's why there is a letter in there from St. Paul to the Corinthians, because Corinth was a major Jesus movement center. The Gospel of Matthew, interestingly enough, had to have been written by somebody who had never been to Palestine, because he doesn't know where things are. He has Jesus and his disciples traveling from point A to point B in an afternoon that would have taken 3 days, and a couple of walks taking several days that would have been of an afternoon. He just doesn't know the geography. So as he's describing Jesus' ministry, he gets a lot of it geographically impossibly wrong. Because that's not what he's writing. He's not trying to write a historical document. He's trying to write the meaning of this movement that it had for those people who experienced it and who experienced that immediate aftermath of his death. How you write to communicate that kind of a heavy, powerful, emotional experience is what the literature is about. And the whole thing's fascinating. And I will, even though I don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, I don't believe that his death saved the universe. The universe didn't need saving. Incidentally, in the gospel, in the letters of St. Paul, there's some interesting lines. Paul also says that in one of the letters that in Jesus the whole cosmos has been redeemed. It's not redeemed just for those that believe. It's not some kind of faith miracle where if you can manage to believe something that you know ain't so, you somehow good things happen. It is a fact that the cosmos is redeemed, Paul alleges. This is one of those phrases that our Universalist ancestors latched onto and said, wait a minute, if this is true, then the whole concept of hell is baloney. And indeed, you will not find in the oldest level of our literature, the letters of St. Paul, you will not find the concept of hell that you find, for example, in the book of Revelation. It simply isn't there. Paul believed, and he says it very straightforwardly, Paul believed that those people who died in Christ and those who were in Christ when the kingdom of God finally arrived with power, those people would live. Those who died who were not in Christ simply stayed dead. The only people who get resurrected are those who died in Christ. You don't find that in the Creed, but here's the oldest layer of the literature with that set of ideas in it. For me, the fascination is not with which version of the Gospels is true. For me, the fascination is with those communities themselves, those egalitarian communities that were so unusual that they called themselves positively to the attention of the Roman authorities. That's the phenomenon that I find fascinating. And so I read their Gospels and study their materials and try to ask myself, what is it that made that kind of community occur, and what does it take to create it today? That's what the literature is about.